Heya, welcome back to another video. Thank you for joining me today. As always, I hope you're keeping well. So today's video is an exciting one for me to do because it marks the fact that I have completed my 6-month book buying ban. So I was on it from mid-January to mid-July. I had no intentions of cheating or pre-ordering books or treating myself to one book a month. It was a flat out ban. So it feels fantastic to have finally completed it, and it has absolutely left a lasting effect on myself and my buying habits. So I thought for today's video I would share my tips and tricks on how you can stay on a successful book buying ban if you're someone who feels like you have a bit of a shopping problem, if you find that you're just feeling overwhelmed by the amount of unread books you have. I'm a firm believer that at the end of the day, your hobby should not be stressful. And if buying books is becoming an issue for you, if you're noticing you're starting to feel stressed by it, or you're noticing you're starting to feel overwhelmed each time you look at your bookcase because of the sheer amount of unread books on it, it is probably about time that you look at yourself and look at your buying habits in order to figure out what it is you can do to improve upon these things. So whether you're someone who just wants to minimize the amount of books that you're buying each month, or whether you're someone who just wants to go on a full-blown book buying ban, stay tuned because I've got you covered with every single tip that I could possibly think of in order for you to survive this. So of course it's lovely to have a nice selection of unread books on your shelves in case you're a mood reader or you're someone who's a bit indecisive about what you're planning to read next. But I've noticed that everyone has a certain number where they feel like this amount is just too many unread books, and after this point continuing to acquire books becomes a problem. And as people love to famously say, buying books and reading books are two completely different hobbies. And it's kind of sad to see that separation personally, because I find that as a reader, you know yourself that you're going to get to these books eventually. I can delve into that treat yourself mentality. I can delve into that buying something just to cheer myself up and buying something to have something to look forward to in the future. That's something I really learned about myself over the last 6 months, of like where my unhealthy buying habits are coming from and what feelings are causing them. And I suppose that's where I'll start. So initially, I would say before you even think of going on a ban, maybe track your purchases for a month before you're aiming to go on a book buying ban, just to have a look more so at the feelings that you're having when you're going about making your purchases. Is it something that you are genuinely looking forward to and have done for a while? Is it a favorite author of yours that you're genuinely excited for? Or are you just going to a bookshop because you're having a bad day and you feel like you need to treat yourself? Are you going in blind and not really knowing anything about the book that you're going to be picking up, and you've just been really influenced by what you've seen online? Documenting for yourself personally what your headspace is like going into buying a load of books, and really seeing how you feel beforehand, and especially marking down how you feel afterwards. Like, are you still genuinely excited, or has that excitement actually dwindled off now that you've got these books and they're on your shelves? I think that's one of the main things that everyone who suffers from overspending or over shopping needs to think about, is addressing the want versus need aspect to it. My next tip would be to convert your wish list into a pen and paper wish list, so that you're not going out of your way to go onto book websites or onto apps on your phone to basically window shop these books, because I feel like that can be very triggering, because it's so easy to add something to your basket and buy it. Whereas if you take the temptation out of it, where you're not actively looking at a wish list where you can see that, oh, this has dropped down in price, maybe I should buy it now while it's cheap, or that you're not influenced by the book covers. I found that when I wrote down my actual wish list, I realized that half the books on this wish list I wasn't actually really interested in. I was someone who every single day I would go on different websites and I would check if anything had dropped in price. And this wasn't just for books, this would also be for like video games too, or whatever it is I wanted or I needed. I would just regularly check the prices on things to see if I could get a bargain, because I feel like that was my main thing, was looking to see if I could get a bargain. And at the end of the day, I wasn't really getting a bargain because I was going out of my way to buy something that I didn't actually need. My next tip is what I refer to as reality check. You should write down again every single unread book that you currently own. Again, this tip applies to people who simply feel that you just have far too many unread books and that you're unread book pile is just getting completely out of control. I'll show you my list that I wrote in my bullet journal at the start of the year, but I can say it was incredibly humbling writing out every single title that I hadn't read yet, and I was shocked. And as someone who has a small book collection in comparison to other bookish content creators, I thought that was absolutely shocking, because that meant that over 1/3 of my book collection was unread, and that really was the reality check that I needed to humble myself and realize like there is absolutely no need for me to be going out and buying more books. This is a good period of time when you're documenting all your unread books, is to go through them and take out the ones that you feel like you have no longer any interest in reading. They might have been impulse purchases. They might have ended up getting really bad reviews and you bought it on day one not knowing. It's a good time to be able to kind of cull your collection down a little bit. My next tip is for your budget. So whether you're someone who is just trying to minimize the amount of books that you're buying each month, or if you're going on a flat out book buying ban, thinking about your budget and how much you're spending on books is a huge motivating factor when it comes to not doing it anymore. And thinking about the redistribution of that money, where that money could go instead. Obviously, in this day and age, it has become a massive privilege to have a disposable income. And what you do with that income is up to you each month. But if you can redistribute it towards an area that you feel would be more productive for yourself, whether you're just wanting to become more financially stable, you want to build a nest egg, you want to save towards something, maybe a holiday, and instead of having that money sitting in the form of books on your bookshelf that realistically you're not going to be able to get that money back out of if you were to sell these books. I think that's the most grown-up element of this video, is to really think about where your money's going, how you're spending it, how you could be making better choices with it. And if you want to treat yourself now and again, that's perfectly fine. But I think in this day and age of social media and being chronically online and seeing how other people are spending their money on books and seeing these massive book hauls, you can definitely say that there is an influence there. I think there's a lot to be said when it comes to smoke and mirrors of the online bookish spaces. One of the things that is very taboo to talk about is how people can afford to do these massive book hauls every now and again. And something that we never really address is the fact that it could very much come down to incurring a massive amount of credit card debt just to be able to make bookish content to show off. And I think that's something that we ought to really think about as a community, especially now that the underconsumption trend is now happening, which I absolutely adore. It's really refreshing to see people just live as I do and not perpetuate all this ridiculous amount of spending in order to feel like you're fitting in. Even something else to motivate you to stick to a book buying ban is taking a tenner a week and putting it in a jar for however long your book buying ban is going to be, and then using that bit of savings to then treat yourself once it's finally all said and done. Sometimes you do need a bit of motivation. You do need that one thing to look forward to. In that same breath, if you find that you're someone who's very easily influenced by what you see online, maybe think about stopping consuming bookish content on YouTube or BookTok or wherever you get your content from for the time being, because it can be really difficult when you're watching other people do these massive unboxings and, you know, wanting to feel like you're part of that. I know some people can get that vibe of like window shopping or living vicariously through someone else as they're doing a big book haul. I even find that I can simply become influenced just by a bookshelf behind someone who's filming. And I feel like we can get hung up on these really minute sort of distractions. And if you find that like maybe I just need to dip out of the booktube community for the time being, maybe tap in now and again with some of your favorite creators, or just go to creators that you know you're not going to necessarily be influenced by. And you have to remember and remind yourself sometimes that if you're someone who is lucky enough to live near a library that is still getting fully funded, you will have access to almost every single book that you see people talk about online. This is something that has massively gotten me through my book buying ban, so much so that I feel like I read too many library books for the time period instead of reading my own books that I needed to get through. I've read so many debut authors and new releases simply thanks to my library and been able to, you know, try before I buy basically. I've just saved myself a whole heap of money, because we know that new releases and books in general are so expensive these days. And I would just really recommend for people to give their library a second shot if you're lucky enough to live near one, because you don't realize until you start using it regularly again how many facilities and how many events that they also put on, and just how much they do for the local community. My next tip would be to wait for the reviews. So if you're someone who does a lot of pre-orders, or if you're someone who's just really hyped for certain books that are going to be coming out over the next while, wait for the reviews to come out before you go ahead and pre-order, or before you go ahead and buy the book. Because I found over the 6 months that I wasn't buying any books, that some of the books that I was really hyped for, that I was really looking forward to, ended up getting really mediocre reviews. And again, in the long run, it ended up saving me my time and my money. And it was really sort of grounding for me to see other people's book buying regrets, because it just made me feel like I was on the right track with what I was doing, and I could just continue on and just, put the blinders on and focus. Personally, I use Storygraph and Goodreads to look at specific book reviews. I find that those are the most kind of like honest ways that I find reviews, and it really does remind you to take a step back and to not get sucked into the hype of new releases. My last tip would be to reassure yourself and to ground yourself in moments of FOMO, to just say to yourself that these books aren't going to be going anywhere anytime soon. I think it's safe to say that most of us aren't reading really old, out of print books, and most of the books that we are planning to read are just constantly available, and they're available in multiple different formats. At the end of the day, what is the difference between a book sitting on a bookshelf in a bookshop unread and a book that is sitting on my bookshelf unread? They're both still collecting dust. I have had times in the past where I have bulk bought things because I thought that they were going to be unavailable. I think a lot of us experienced that. For example, when the book depository shut down, I acquired a lot of books that I did not need at the time, only to find out that later on they were actually available to me. And I was kind of left feeling really regretful and kind of angry about how much I had spent. Even if something shuts down overnight, I'm still going to have access to these books. They might not be in the cover that I particularly desire, but I'm still going to be lucky enough to have access to them. And I think that's something that we often need to remind ourselves of. Now I just want to briefly talk about my own experience as someone who reads and who loves to buy books, going on a 6-month book buying ban and actually completing it and coming out the other end with a whole new perspective on my own personal shopping habits and spending habits. I suppose the first thing that I really noticed once I came off the book ban was my urge to buy new books has really decreased over the last couple of months. I was under the impression when I started this that I would be immediately on Amazon filling up a cart of books, but that was not the case. I feel like I'm more intentional with my spending now, and I'm hoping that this has a lasting effect because it has been so beneficial to me. Something that I noticed about myself while I had these urges while I was on my book buying ban was that I would either go on to the library app and order the book in myself, or then I would actually just go and put 10 or 20 euro into my savings account as a way to save that money, to be like, this money that you would have bought on this book, well, we're going to save it and we're going to put it over here for later. I really have found that I just do not need that instant gratification that I really used to. And nowadays I find that I ask myself a series of questions before I make not only a book purchase, but any sort of purchase in general. When it comes to the book format of these questions, they would be, do I really want this? Do I really need this? How soon will I be able to get to it? Do the reviews say that it's good? Is it worth the current price? Could I wait for it to come down in price? And then finally, could I get it at the library? And those are really the 7 questions that I focus on every single time I am finding myself with that urge to buy something new. Another aspect I have learned about myself is how long it takes me to get through a book, and putting that time into my motivation for not buying a book. Because realistically, if I'm reading a book that's 250 pages, it can take me 2 or 3 days of consecutive reading to actually get to it. So if I'm buying a book, that is potentially 3 days of my life that is going to take for me to get through it. And kind of thinking about it in the same way that you'd think of, okay, well, how much money do I earn in an hour? and how much does this cost? Is it worth working 1 hour to just buy this one thing? That was my kind of mentality when it comes to it. And that has been, again, a big motivating factor in staying on track and just realizing, how fast it is that I read. There's sometimes that I can really speed read. There's other times where I feel like I'm just being absolutely dragged through a book for weeks at a time. I don't really have a solid reading routine. There's a lot of ups and downs. There's not really a whole heap of consistency with it. Thinking about my reading pace and my buying pace has really just impacted how I view buying books now. Another aspect of my motivation was to continuously to remind myself that I do not in fact have all the space for all the books that I may potentially want. And knowing that when I came off the ban, I'd realistically have to do a good bit of unhauling if I wanted to bring new books into my collection. And something that I have done in the past, I really did it a lot when I was a poor college student, but I've started really doing it again, is to trade in my old books in order to get a credit note, and that's what I will use to buy secondhand books in Chapters. That's what I primarily will do. A lot of the time that I buy a book from Chapters, it's usually with a credit note for the most part, or then it's from like their sale section. I really like the idea of out with the old, in with the new, but I also really like the idea of paying for the new with the old, because it just feels like I'm kind of recycling my money in that sense. And it makes such a big difference to my end of year spending stats when I can look back and say, okay, so the bulk of the books that I bought secondhand, I actually was able to do it with a voucher. And my main rule for my book buying ban was that there was no exceptions. I know people will make exceptions for pre-orders, but I felt going into it that if I was to make a load of pre-orders for each month that I was going to be on my book buying ban, that was basically cheating in my eyes for me. I did have the exception of receiving books as a gift, but I knew that that wouldn't really happen because my ban was over a time period where there was no reasons for me to actually be getting gifts, because it was after my birthday and there was no other real event in there that I should be getting any sort of books. I got one book for review from Serpent's Tail. I got one book as a gift from my mum, which was actually from a charity shop. And the third one I ended up just getting for free randomly. Another rule that I had while I was on my book buying ban was that I wanted in that time, or just after that time, to be able to reduce my physical TBR by 50%. So it went from 122 books down to, I think it is currently at 92. So in order to get to that goal, I have to read 23 more of my unread books, and then that will be successfully achieved. And I'm really looking forward to it because it's only like 19% to go. It's only 23 more books, and I still have a lot of very short books on my TBR, so I feel like I can achieve that hopefully within the next like 2 or 3 months. My new rules for when it comes to buying books is that as soon as I buy them, I have to read them as soon as possible. So I don't want to have any books that are just left sitting around unread. It's also beneficial for the content because obviously you'll see me haul a book or talk about a book that I want to read, and then you'll see me read it pretty soon after I get it. Another rule for myself is really just tracking my spending. I always kind of tried to keep an eye on my spending, but now I'm really focused on it. For the last 2 years in my end of year stats videos, I have discussed the amount of money that I've spent overall for the year on books. And that's something that I'm really hyper vigilant of now. Last year was kind of like really bad when it came to how much I spent on books. This year, if I can do less than half of the damage that I did last year, I feel like that would be quite successful. My next rule is obviously to use the library as much as possible, and that's not going to stop anytime soon. I have been doing little library book hauls over on my TikTok, and obviously my last video that I posted was a library book haul. There's something that I'm still really interested in doing. I find that it's a great way to really kind of diversify your reading, to pick up authors you may not have originally thought you'd be very interested in. I feel like using the library has been probably the best thing that I have done for my own personal reading and my reading goals, because I'm reading a lot more books than I usually would. And I think it's just because I'm aware of the time constraints, and that's what makes me read them a little bit faster than I usually would. It's just such an enjoyable aspect of my week when I get to go to the library and bring all the old books back and get out the new books and pick up the books that I've ordered in. I like the kind of solace that the library brings, as well as the bountiful books. And finally, I feel like I'm at the point where I know my reading taste pretty well. I feel like I have officially not necessarily boxed myself into certain genres. There are just certain things and themes that I personally really enjoy reading about, and those are going to be the books that I tend to focus on picking up. And because of that, I don't find that I make as many impulse purchases as I would have when, say, I initially started the channel. So if you're new on this journey, don't be hard on yourself, because there is a lot of trial and error before you really get to know yourself as a reader. I have my favorite authors. I have authors that are currently living that I get to look forward to their new releases. That's something that you don't really get when you read a lot of classic literature. And it is nice to have things to look forward to and to get excited and to get hyped up for new book releases. But as with everything with this video, in moderation. So that has been all my tips and tricks on surviving a book buying ban. If you have any tips and tricks that I didn't mention, feel free to leave them below. We all need that extra little bit of motivation from time to time to stay on track of our spending and our reading habits and all that sort of thing. If you want to keep up with me outside of YouTube, you can always follow me on my TikTok and my Instagram, where I make short form bookish content that I don't necessarily post over here. And if you haven't done so already, please feel free to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out. And as always, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will talk to you soon. Goodbye.